always true.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
Retired U.S. General John Allen is running the biggest campaign of his career. But he's not in charge of the coalition air war against ISIL, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. Allen's brief is larger, much, much larger. He's trying to starve ISIL of its cash, to destroy its PR machine that has drawn thousands of would-be fighters from around the world to Syria and Iraq, and to help the many tens of thousands of people terrorized and displaced by the group. But the mission is complicated. More than 60 countries are involved. Old political tensions are aggravated by what Allen says is the need for cooperation. And defeating ISIL, says the former commander of U.S. troops in the Middle East, could take years. General John Allen describes the shape of the campaign, the challenges, and the early successes when he talks to Al Jazeera. General John Allen, thank you so much for joining Al Jazeera.
Pleasure to be with you today, Roz.
But when we think of communities or cities such as Raqqa in Syria or in Mosul in northern Iraq, there are many who believe that the only way to reclaim these two cities from ISIL is to actually send in ground troops. If so, whose ground troops are going in?
In this case, there'll be Iraqi ground troops for Mosul. Tikrit was what we call a built-up area. Built-up area in the context of a complex urban environment, which has streets, high buildings, sewer systems that run under the roads, that provide tunnels, and those kinds of dimensions of the operational environment.
Right.
And so when you do clearing operations in an environment like that, a complex urban environment, you need the right kinds of troops with the right kinds of training and the right kinds of weapons, ultimately, to accomplish that. You don't do it except through very deliberate planning, and you want to spend some time shaping the environment, shaping the enemy, and ensuring that you have the capacity to operate effectively within that environment before you take it on. The urban complex is one of the most challenging operational environments for any military force. And of course, much of...
Deadly.
Well, casualties are very high in those operations, typically.
How do you prepare the Iraqi public for that possibility if and when Mosul happens? How does the Abadi government do that?
Well, I think we find ourselves in a situation where the Iraqi public is committed, just as is the Prime Minister, who's the Commander-in-Chief, is committed to the defeat of Daesh. And they understand that this commitment is going to require sacrifice on the part of the Iraqi people. You know, the end state of this is the defeat of Daesh. It's the restoration of the territorial integrity of Iraq and the sovereignty of the country. And they experienced horrendous casualties at the hands of Daesh last year after the June offensive, and the country very nearly came apart. And so I think we will find that the Iraqi people recognize that the effectiveness of the counteroffensive will not just be the effectiveness of the military capacity of the Iraqi security forces, but it'll be the effectiveness of the morale of the Iraqi people to persevere during a very difficult time and recognize that there will be casualties that will be taken. And no one takes casualties lightly. And I know the Iraqi people very well, and they treasure every single young life that goes in that battle space, regardless of the sectarian dimension of it, whether it's Shia or Sunni or Kurdish. They treasure every one of those lives, but I think they recognize that in recovering a city of 1.5 million people, Mosul, there will be casualties. And no one will spend those lives easily. No one will spend those lives lightly, but I think the Iraqi people understand that in order to recover their country, there will be sacrifices that will have to be made in the future.
You touched on another part or another dimension of this fight. It's not just Iraq and the coalition against ISIL. It's about dealing with sectarian strife. We've heard the reports about it in Amerli last year. We're hearing about fears of reprisals among Sunnis by Shiite militias now, post-Tikrit, concerns about what was happening around Ramadi just in the past few days before those airstrikes. Does the coalition have a moral obligation to stay engaged as long as possible to essentially get both Sunni and Shia to learn how to coexist again inside Iraq?
Well, the coalition is present in Iraq today to assist the Iraqis ultimately in defeating Daesh, recovering the territorial integrity of their country. In the process of that, we, of course, as the U.S. government, but also more broadly the coalition governments, are very much committed to assisting Prime Minister Abadi in creating the environment of governance that brings to an end the kinds of sectarian strife that have characterized Iraqi politics and the Iraqi society to this point. I think we really have a remarkable leader in Prime Minister Abadi right now. When you consider what he inherited on the 8th of September when he took over last year, a country teetering on the brink of collapse, a military force that was fleeing ahead of Daesh, sectarian dimension to the politics that was that seemed to be almost irreconcilable. He's come a very long way. He's got a full cabinet now. He's passed a budget. The oil deal with the Kurds is a proposition that was a decade in the making. It's very solid right now. He's just returned from the North, the KRG, where he had excellent meetings with President Barzani about the future and how they would cooperate together. My sense is that this is the leader who's going to do all he can to ultimately eliminate the sectarian differences that he inherited and the sectarian differences that he will have to navigate and ultimately seek to diminish if Iraq will emerge whole, complete, and at peace at the end of this long journey that we're currently accompanying them.
Some partisans, frankly, will argue, let's not be naive. Part of Abadi's apparent success, they will argue, is that he has a working relationship with Tehran. How does Washington balance his need to be a credible regional leader with its own national security objectives?
Well, first, Iran, we have to accept the fact that Iran has a long border with Iraq. It has an ancient interrelationship between the peoples of Iran and the peoples of Iraq. So we have to understand that and we have to accept it. But I think what's important to understand is while there is Iranian influence in Iraq, there's also Iraqi influence in Iran. And my understanding is, both by virtue of the encouragement of the Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, of the work that Prime Minister Abadi has done, Prime Minister Abadi has also been clear in the relationship with Iran in saying that while there will be a relationship with Iran, it will not be the only relationship that Iraq will have. And I think we sometimes find ourselves trying to seek a zero-sum outcome with Iran. If we're up, Iran has to be down. If Iran is up, we have to be down. We don't have to see it that way. I think Prime Minister Abadi has been very pragmatic in that regard. And while his predecessor really had very few options with respect to relationships in the region, and in fact, really one option, and that was with Tehran and with the Iranians, Prime Minister Abadi has been, I believe, masterful, frankly, in not only managing the relationship with Iran, but managing the relationship with his neighbors, and beyond the neighbors, the broad coalition. And we've been clear in our conversations that the coalition today has operational benefit to Iraq, but the coalition tomorrow has strategic benefit to Iraq, and that is the relationships that will play out today in terms of military support or the other dimensions that the coalition brings to bear will play out in long-term political alignments and economic opportunities that Iraq can only now begin to imagine. And that's the benefit of the coalition in the end to Iraq and to Prime Minister Abadi.
Beyond responding militarily, what's most important right now? Stopping the flow of foreign fighters, upwards of 25,000 people supposedly in the region now, or stopping the funding that supports their ability to be there and fight?
I wouldn't place one above another. We need to pressurize them simultaneously across all these lines of effort. As I said before, the inability of Daesh to turn in any direction and find safe haven, if you will, whether it's physical safe haven or safe haven in the financial space or safe haven in the recruits that it's able to muster. We want to pressure Daesh across all of those lines of effort, as I said, to pressurize its nervous system across the entire entity. And so it's important that we stem the flow of foreign fighters. And that number, 25,000, is always useful to take apart because some number of those foreign fighters have gone home. They just went home. Some number of those foreign fighters have been killed. Some number of those foreign fighters are inactive in some form or another. So while the number may total to 25,000, some number substantially less is actually what's operating in the area. In terms of the finances, we know that it operates along a number, Daesh operates along a number of lines, whether it's the illicit oil industry, whether it's the massive extortion that it perpetrates upon the population that it subjugates, whether it's the sale of antiquities, whether it's the bank holdings that were captured in the opening days of the campaign, or even this horrific slave trade that they have created. We're going to go after each one of those lines as well to begin to pressurize all of that. So Daesh finds it even more difficult than it finds right now to be able to generate the kinds of funding that gives it operational discretion. And then, of course, in the messaging, we have to deglamorize Daesh. We have to explode this myth of inevitability of the caliphate. We have to explode this myth of invincibility. And, of course, explode literally is what's happening all over the battle space in Iraq. Where Daesh meets organized Iraqi security forces supported by the coalition, they have lost every battle. And they're going to continue to lose battles, and those battles are going to get bigger and bigger, and the losses are going to become bigger and bigger. And we'll leverage that as time goes on. We'll leverage it by messaging it, and as we leverage the fact that Daesh is being defeated, and it's being defeated now, as with that defeat becomes more prominent and more obvious, the messaging will become even more important because it will seek to delegitimize the value of joining this movement. And then that strikes a blow at the willingness of young men and women to come from their host nations to become foreign fighters. So all of these are inextricably linked, and it's difficult to prioritize one over another.
Is that what you're hearing when you talk with leaders in Malaysia, when you talk with your Russian counterparts, when you talk with people in France or in the UK who are particularly worried about their young people just picking up and going off to join the fight?
They are. And I think it's one of the really powerful outcomes of the coalition has been the willingness of many of these countries to pass legislation to deal with the individual that has gone to the battle space and come back. In our own way, we have as well. But there's also been significant interest, not just in holding these young men and increasingly young women, holding them accountable for having gone to Syria and Iraq and returning. In a legal basis, there's also, as a direct result of the coalition, a widespread conversation about rehabilitation and de-radicalization as well. It's a really important complement to holding people accountable when they come home, because what we want to do ultimately is be able to return them to their societies, to be able to return them into the social fabric from which they came. They were deluded by the message of Daesh. They went to the battle space. Somehow they survived, somehow, because it's going to be increasingly difficult as time goes on, and they came home. Many of them are coming home because what they discovered when they finally got into the ranks of Daesh and ISIL was that it was far less than it had been advertised to be, and the conditions were not anything akin to what they had been led to believe. The money wasn't there, their access to slaves wasn't there, and that was a big recruiting tool for them. They're frankly losing in the battle space. Their comrades all around them are getting killed, and they're finding that the environment is pretty horrendous. And many of them have tried to go home, and they've been killed by Daesh for doing it. And so when they finally do get home, unless they have been specifically sent home and as a perpetrator, ultimately to target some aspect of the civil society in which they emerged, not only do we need to be prepared to hold them accountable in accordance with the rule of law in these various societies, I think very importantly, because in the end we are a compassionate people, it's important to explore how rehabilitation and de-radicalization can be brought to bear as well to return these young men and women to being useful citizens within their communities and ultimately their countries.
Is it troublesome that many of them are coming from educated, middle-class backgrounds?
Well, some do, and that's, I think, certainly a phenomenon that deserves our study. But as I think you're aware, I know you're aware, the power of social media is really significant. And in many respects, as Daesh was able to make certain battlefield accomplishments last summer, for example, Their numbers weren't great, but their message was powerful, and it was vastly magnified by social media. And that, in fact, caused many of the difficulties associated with the morale of the Iraqi army when it faced Daesh last summer. The attractiveness of the caliphate, the attractiveness of Daesh has been vastly magnified by social media, whether it's YouTube or Twitter or Facebook or some of the other platforms, social media platforms, that permits these young men and women to access this message and sometimes to participate in this message. And just that participation often creates an allure and an influence that is difficult to counter. That's why the outreach to communities by central governments in the United States, the Department of Homeland Security, under the leadership of Secretary Johnson, the FBI, the Attorney General, the outreach to communities that potentially are at risk has been very important in working with community leaders, whether it's teachers or imams or mullahs or tribal leaders here in the United States within these communities, and family leadership, family members, to let them understand, to help them to understand, because many of them come from traditional societies where social media is foreign to them, to help them to understand what poison is being poured into the ears of their children through the Daesh message.
Could it be argued that Daesh or ISIL is taking advantage of some of the social strains here in the West? Here in the United States, we see anti-Muslim rhetoric. We see anti-immigrant rhetoric, and Daesh is playing on that. And for a vulnerable teenager, that might just be the message that person wants to hear.
Daesh is a very opportunistic organization, and I think it will seek those opportunities where it can find them. I think happily in the United States, being a country where all of us hail from some immigrant tradition, we are a country which is really blessed in so many ways to be able to assimilate the populations that come from so many different, diverse, and not unusual, but diverse backgrounds. And so in this country, while there may be segments of youthful populations that feel as though they may be discriminated against, or that the mainstream of American society doesn't understand them, and Daesh is willing to capitalize on that, I think the outreach of Department of Homeland Security and the FBI and the Attorney General and other local communities, as well as greater responsibility with respect to content in social media, helps to combat this potential sense that they are an ostracized element of the population and to exploit it. I think we are seeing that we're achieving success in that regard, and other of our allies within the coalition are picking up on this, and within the nature of their own societies and the at-risk populations, they're reaching out to them as well, and that's a very healthy dimension of what's happening within the coalition.
The counter-messaging hub in the UAE, is it up and running? Is it working? How do you measure it?
Well, we'll measure it over time. As you know, counter-messaging, this kind of an aspect within the campaign, is a long-term dimension of the strategy. It's an important part of the strategy. When we have defeated the idea of Daesh, then we have truly defeated Daesh. We're going to defeat Daesh militarily, and that's unfolding as you and I sit here today. But the attractiveness of Daesh and the allure of that message, when we can defeat that, that will ultimately spell the end of this movement. The willingness of the United Arab Emirates to create this messaging hub and to invite regional partners into the hub, that's a very good start. And it's just beginning. We're just getting the traction in it now. So it's going to take a while. Our vision ultimately is to try to create hubs that would touch the European population, a hub that might touch the Southeast Asian population. And frankly, what I think has been a very powerful and important dimension of this coalition has been a message akin to that of His Majesty King Abdullah II in Jordan, which is that the Arab states must take leadership within the coalition, and that this is about taking back the faith of Islam. And they say very clearly, and we listen to it very clearly and very carefully, that the face of this message must be Arab, and the voice of this message must be Muslim. And that is how we will be most effective in the counter-messaging campaign, by providing the right face and the right voice locally to attract the attention of those communities that might be at risk, and then to compete in the information space against this narrative that Daesh has attempted to put forward.
You spent most of your career in the military as a general officer, but your training, your focus, all of your work was against an enemy that was another sovereign state. ISIL is not a sovereign state. Where's the capacity, ultimately, for confronting it and for defeating it?
In many ways, Roz, it's how I described it before. And I would say that in many respects, Daesh has become a proto-state in some respects. It points to a piece of terrain that it calls a capital. It has attempted local governance through emirs and walis that look like provincial governments. It has even attempted to have its own currency. So in some respects, when it transitioned to becoming a proto-state, it created its own vulnerabilities. And as you have heard me explain the strategy, because we can sense those vulnerabilities, and because we know those vulnerabilities, in fact, are inextricably linked, and a combination of pressures on those vulnerabilities will ultimately begin to degrade Daesh and ultimately to fold it up, to defeat it. That's how we've gone after it. So whether it's a movement of non-state actors with some significant coherence, whether it's a proto-state or whether it's a nation-state, if you go after its finances, then you strangle it. If you go after its ability to reinforce itself, then you deny it the kinds of force generation necessary to be sustainable in combat. If you go after its messaging capacity, its ability to dominate the information space and influence a particular audience or multiple audiences, either to terrorize them or to recruit them, then you've denied them the ability ultimately to, as I said, to generate the kinds of forces necessary. And then you ultimately must deal with it in a kinetic way as well. And that's a function of both the very careful employment of special operations, and in this case, the President of the United States has made the decision, along with our coalition partners, rather than putting foreign boots on the ground, to do what the Iraqis really want, which is to give the Iraqis the capacity and to provide the support to the Iraqis to do what they want, which is to recover their country themselves. And so we'll provide advice and assistance, we'll provide fire support to the maneuver of their forces, we'll provide training, and we'll provide equipment. And so, yes, Daesh, in this case, began as a non-state actor. It evolved into a proto-state, and we're administering the punishment to Daesh across all those lines of effort, the combination of which will degrade it over time and ultimately destroy it.
How long will this take?
It's going to take a while. It didn't start overnight. Daesh is a long-time movement. It has evolved over several different iterations.
Are we talking 5 years, 10 years?
Well, I'd be careful about any particular timeline. I think we're talking years. But in this case, we have seen that the Iraqis are moving very quickly, I think, and pretty deftly towards creating the kinds of forces necessary to be able to administer the physical defeat of Daesh that's necessary. There are other aspects, as I said, of the lines of effort that will bring pressure to bear upon Daesh that will ultimately cause it to fold internally. But it's not going to be quick, and it's not going to be tomorrow. And we all have to recognize that this is going to take a while.
And your message, General, to the people living in Syria, in Iraq, who have had to flee to Turkey or to Jordan to try to get away from ISIL, will they be able to go home?
That's our hope. That's our prayer, is that there will come the day, and relatively soon, where Iraq will be whole again, its territorial integrity restored, its sovereignty restored, so that whether they're internally displaced inside the country or they fled throughout the region, they can go home and they can reestablish themselves within the mainstream of society and live in a society where their citizenship is valued by all Iraqis or all Syrians, and live in a society where they can be a contributing part, ultimately, of the future of that country. That is our prayer.
General John Allen, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Great to be with you, Roz.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you.